I moved into the old house in late September of 2019. I had always been drawn to antiquated places, their creaking floors, the whispered stories of past inhabitants, the weight of history that seeped into every brick and beam. The house, a two-story Victorian with peeling wallpaper and narrow hallways, had been abandoned for years. I inherited it from a distant relative I barely remembered. In a way, it felt like fate that I ended up here. I had hoped the solitude and the storied ambience would provide inspiration for my writing and a refuge from the chaos of the city. I never imagined that what I would find inside would shatter everything I thought I knew about reality. The first week was uneventful aside from the usual troubles of moving into an old building, the unreliable plumbing, the persistent draft in the hallways, and the eerie silence that seemed to press against the walls. I spent most of my days cataloging my belongings, dusting off forgotten furniture, and exploring the nooks and crannies of the house. One afternoon, while rummaging through a cluttered attic filled with moth-eaten quilts and yellowed letters, I came across an object that would haunt me for years. A small, framed photograph. The frame was ornate, its gilded edges tarnished by time, and the photograph inside was sepia-toned. It depicted a group of people gathered in what looked like a parlor. The faces were stern and formal, the eyes seeming to look right through the viewer. I recall feeling an inexplicable chill when I first lifted it from a battered wooden trunk. There was no inscription on the back, no date, no explanation, just an image that felt heavy with unspoken secrets. That night, I cleaned the photograph and hung it in the living room, thinking it would lend an air of historical authenticity to the otherwise sparse decor. I placed it on the mantel above a small stone fireplace. I remember the way the lamplight caught the worn edges of the frame, making it seem as if the faces inside were alive, their eyes flickering in the half-light. I thought little of it at the time, attributing the unsettling feeling to my imagination and the eerie silence of the old house. The next morning, I awoke to a bizarre and disconcerting sight. As I shuffled into the living room bleary-eyed, I glanced at the photograph on the mantel and froze. The image had changed. The group in the photograph was still there, but their positions had shifted. One of the women, who had been standing near the window the previous day, was now seated in a chair. The man at the center of the group now wore a look of anguish instead of stoic indifference. Even the background had altered slightly. A new door appeared in the upper left corner where none had existed before. I rubbed my eyes, certain that exhaustion had tricked me. Yet when I looked again, the change remained. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light. I examined the frame carefully, turning it over, checking for hidden mechanisms or any signs that someone might have tampered with it. Everything appeared perfectly normal. There were no strings or concealed magnets. The photograph itself was printed on quality paper and showed no sign of damage or reprinting. Yet the alteration was undeniable. I spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious unease. I avoided looking at the photograph, but I could not escape it. Its presence seemed to be embedded in the very air of the living room. I would catch glimpses of it in reflections in darkened windows, and, at night, I could almost hear the soft rustling of paper as if it were shifting on its own. I tried to convince myself that I was simply overworked and that the stress of moving into an old house had played tricks on my mind. However, a small seed of dread had been planted. Over the next several days, I began to notice subtle differences in the photograph that I could not explain. Each morning, when I woke up and shuffled into the living room, I would catch a glimpse of a new detail, a slight change in expression, a new object in the background, or even a shadowy figure that seemed to have been added to the gathering. One day, a small child appeared at the edge of the group, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The following day, the background window revealed a view of a stormy sky instead of the calm interior I had seen before. I documented these changes in a journal that I kept on my bedside table, writing down the time I saw the photograph and describing every alteration in painstaking detail. I began to suspect that the photograph was not static at all, but was evolving, changing its contents each day with a precision that defied explanation. At first, I considered the possibility that I was the victim of a prank or that someone in the house, perhaps a former caretaker, had left a mechanism to alter the image gradually. But as I researched the history of the house and the photograph itself, I found no record of any such device. In fact, the photograph was listed in a few old estate records as having been the family for generations. The idea that this object might be imbued with some sort of supernatural power became increasingly difficult to dismiss. One night, I awoke from a fitful sleep, heart pounding to the sound of soft tapping. I lay in bed in darkness, trying to trace the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, a subtle, rhythmic tapping that echoed in the stillness. I forced myself to sit up and, with trembling hands, turned on the bedside lamp. The photograph was on the mantel, bathed in the pale glow of the lamp. I studied it closely. Tonight, the changes were even more disturbing. Not only had the positions of the subjects shifted, but I now noticed that the eyes of the man in the center glistened with tears, and the expressions of the others were marked by profound sorrow and despair. In the far background, I could discern what looked like a door ajar, beyond which lay a dark corridor. I felt an almost unbearable compulsion to look closer, to lean in and try to decipher the details, even though every rational part of my mind screamed that I should look away. I could not sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, the photograph fixed in my mind as I attempted to understand its significance. I pored over every detail, comparing it to the notes in my journal, trying to discern a pattern in the changes. Were they random, or did they tell a story? I began to think of the photograph as a kind of window, a portal into another time, or perhaps another reality. I could feel an almost magnetic pull from it, an attraction that bordered on the obsessive. I started to wonder if I were meant to uncover its secret, if my fate was somehow intertwined with the shifting image. The following morning, I decided to take a photograph of the photograph. I set up my own camera on a tripod in front of the mantel and carefully adjusted the focus to capture every nuance of the image. I took several shots, then examined the images on my laptop. To my dismay, the digital images matched what I saw that morning. They showed the altered image exactly as I had observed it, confirming that the photograph was indeed changing and that it was not merely a trick of my perception. The realization that this object defied the very laws of logic and permanence left me both fascinated and terrified. I began to search the internet for any reference to similar phenomena. I delved into online forums, ghost story archives, and esoteric databases of the paranormal. I found scattered mentions of cursed photographs and artifacts that changed their appearance over time, but none that matched the precise and daily evolution of my own. Some accounts described images that predicted future events, while others spoke of objects that revealed hidden truths about the past. A recurring theme in these tales was that the objects were often tied to unresolved tragedies or long-forgotten secrets. I wondered then if the photograph in my possession might be a repository of the family's dark history, a silent witness to events too horrible to be spoken of. I dug deeper into the house's history and discovered that my ancestors had been involved in a series of mysterious incidents. There were rumors of untimely deaths, secret affairs, and even whispered accusations of witchcraft. One old letter, yellowed and brittle, mentioned that the photograph had been passed down as an heirloom and that its image was said to change when a great tragedy was near. I could not help but shudder as I recalled the changes I had observed over the past week. Had the photograph been trying to warn me? Was it foretelling an event yet to come? Or was it merely reflecting a hidden past that I had no choice but to confront? Days turned into weeks, and the changes in the photograph grew bolder and more disturbing. The family gathering that once seemed stately now appeared tormented. Faces twisted in anguish, eyes hollow and accusing. The background grew darker, and on several occasions, I noticed the faint outline of a figure standing behind the group, a figure that seemed to shift its position from one day to the next. One morning, the figure was near the left side of the frame, barely visible in the dim light. The next, it appeared directly behind the man in the center, its presence so overt that I could almost feel its malevolent energy emanating from the printed paper. I began to record these occurrences meticulously, marking each change with exact times and descriptions. The journal filled with pages of my frantic handwriting, my nights spent awake, staring at the photograph as if willing it to reveal its ultimate secret. There were nights when I could not bear the oppressive atmosphere of the house. I would wander through the empty halls in a state of near panic, feeling as though unseen eyes were watching my every move. The sound of my footsteps in the corridor was accompanied by a persistent whispering that I could not attribute to the wind or to the creaks of an old building. I was haunted by the sense that the photograph was not confined to the mantel, but had spread its influence throughout the entire house. At times, I felt a cold hand brushing against my shoulder or the sensation of someone or something standing just behind me in the dark. When I turned, I would find nothing but silence and shadows. One particularly harrowing evening, as a storm raged outside, I sat in the living room with the photograph in full view. Rain lashed the windows and thunder shook the walls. In that tumultuous atmosphere, the changes in the photograph became almost frantic. The figure's expressions contorted in terror, and the background was now filled with dark, swirling shapes that resembled storm clouds but were unnaturally twisted and ominous. I swear I could see a single tear glistening on the cheek of one of the women, a tear that seemed to glisten as if lit from within. I felt an overwhelming sadness and dread as I stared at the image, as if the photograph were revealing not only the past, but also a portent of an imminent calamity. In my desperation, I began to experiment with the photograph. I carefully removed it from the mantel and examined it under various lights: a bright desk lamp, a flickering candle, even the harsh glare of daylight streaming through a window. With each method of illumination, different details emerged. Under the soft glow of the lamp, the figures took on a sorrowful expression. Under the harsh light, The outlines of their faces blurred into something almost monstrous. In the pale light of day, the changes were subtle yet unmistakable, a slight shift in the arrangement of the group, a subtle alteration in the background that hinted at something moving in the distance. It was as if the photograph had multiple layers of meaning, each visible only under a certain kind of light or at a certain time of day. I became increasingly convinced that the photograph was more than a mere object. It was a living record of events that I could not fully comprehend. I took to leaving the photograph in various locations around the house, observing how the ambient conditions affected its appearance. In the kitchen, with a fluorescent light, was harsh and unforgiving. The image seemed to lose its depth, the faces becoming flattened and distorted. In the study, with its warm, amber glow, the image took on a dreamlike quality, the figures appearing to move as if caught in slow motion. Each time I repositioned the photograph, I was struck anew by the uncanny sense that it was watching me, that it was aware of my every action. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a soft, rustling sound coming from the living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up and listened. It was as if someone had gently unfurled the photograph and then set it back down, the faint sound of paper sliding against wood echoing in the silence. I forced myself out of bed and crept down the hallway, every nerve on edge. When I reached the living room, the photograph was exactly as I had left it on the mantel. Yet I could swear that its placement was slightly different, as if it had been moved by an unseen hand. I touched the frame, feeling a subtle vibration that sent a shiver up my spine. I began to suspect that the photograph was not only changing its image, but also its position in the space around me, a phenomenon that defied explanation and hinted at a power far beyond the realm of the ordinary. I recorded every incident in my journal with painstaking detail, hoping that by compiling all these observations, I might uncover a pattern or a message hidden within the seemingly random changes. The entries grew longer with each passing day as my fear deepened and my mind raced with possibilities. I wondered if the photograph was connected to a particular event in the past, if it were a portal to some long-forgotten tragedy or a record of a secret that had been buried with time. I spent hours at the local library searching for any reference to a cursed photograph or an artifact that changed its image on a daily basis. The local newspapers held only vague mentions of unexplained happenings in old houses, but nothing that directly connected to my experience. The more I searched, the more isolated I felt, as if I were the only one left to bear the burden of this unspeakable secret. I began to have nightmares about the photograph. In my dreams, I would see the faces in the image come to life, their eyes pleading and accusatory, their voices rising in a cacophony of despair. I dreamed of following a trail of shifting images through dark corridors and empty rooms, of chasing after figures that dissolved into mist the moment I reached out to grasp them. I woke each time drenched in sweat, heart racing, the echo of whispered voices lingering in the silence of my bedroom. The boundary between waking life and dreams became increasingly blurred, and I found myself questioning whether the photograph was a conduit between these two realms, a threshold through which something malevolent was trying to cross. One afternoon, as a cold rain fell outside and the gray skies pressed in on the city, I sat at my desk trying to piece together the fragments of my experience. I spread out every journal entry, every photograph I had taken of the shifting image, and even scanned the details into my computer in the hope of enhancing them. I spent hours analyzing the data, looking for any common thread that might hint at the underlying truth. Patterns emerged, subtle but undeniable. The changes in the photograph seemed to follow a rhythm, a daily cycle that was as predictable as it was mysterious. In the early morning, the image was dim and shadowed, almost indistinct, as if it were fading from memory. By noon, the photograph would brighten and sharpen, the figures becoming more pronounced and the background taking on a surreal clarity. In the late afternoon, the image would darken again, the faces becoming sorrowful and the entire scene imbued with a haunting melancholy. This cycle repeated with the precision of a metronome, and with each repetition, my unease grew deeper. I began to theorize that the photograph was not static at all, but a living record that responded to time and to the unseen forces that govern my home. I wondered if it was reflecting something from the past, a tragedy, a hidden crime, or perhaps the unspoken sorrows of those who had lived in the house long ago. I recalled the letter I had found tucked away in an old desk drawer during my initial exploration of the house. A letter written in a shaky hand, filled with desperate confessions and warnings that chilled me to the bone. The writer had spoken of a curse, of a photograph that changed every day and revealed terrible truths about its owners. The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted or had succumbed to a terror too great to bear. I could not tell if the letter was a work of fiction or a genuine cry for help from a long-forgotten soul, but its words resonated with the same despair that now gripped me. Each day brought new changes in the photograph, and with them a growing sense of inevitability, a feeling that I was part of something far larger and far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. I began to suspect that the changes were not arbitrary, but that they were tied to a sequence of events that were unfolding not only in the photograph, but in my own life. The more I observed, the more I saw parallels between the expressions of the subjects in the image and my own deteriorating state of mind. I could see a reflection of my isolation, my fear, and my slow descent into paranoia. It was as if the photograph was a mirror that revealed not only a hidden history, but also the darkest parts of my soul. Late one night, when the silence was profound and the only light came from a single, flickering candle on my desk, I felt compelled to confront the photograph directly. With trembling hands, I removed it from the mantel and held it up to the candlelight. In that dim glow, the details became even more unsettling. I could see that the eyes of the man in the center were no longer merely sorrowful. They were filled with an expression of desperation, as though he were silently begging for release. The woman to his right, who had once appeared dignified, now seemed twisted by grief, her features distorted into something that resembled a scream frozen in time. In the background, the vague outlines of a door had given way to what looked unmistakably like a pair of eyes watching from the darkness. I could feel my heart racing as I traced the contours of the image with my fingertips, each touch sending a shiver down my spine. I did not know what compelled me to keep the photograph in my hands at night. Perhaps it was a perverse curiosity, a desire to understand the horror that had invaded my life. Or perhaps it was the sense of inevitability that had grown so overwhelming that I felt I had no choice but to face it. All I know is that in that moment, as I held the photograph close, I heard a soft sound, a murmur that seemed to come from within the very paper itself. It was a sound that resonated with ancient sorrow, a voice that seemed to echo from a place beyond time. I could not make out the words, but I felt that they were a plea, a warning, or perhaps a confession of some long-held secret. In the days that followed, I became increasingly desperate to understand the truth behind the photograph. I reached out to experts in photography restoration and even paranormal investigators, but none could offer an explanation that satisfied me. Some suggested that the changes were the result of chemical reactions in the old paper or the degradation of the chemicals used in the photographic process. Others speculated about the possibility of mass hallucinations or psychological contagion, but these explanations felt inadequate and dismissive of the palpable terror I experienced each time I looked at the image. I began to suspect that the photograph was not simply a relic of the past, but a living artifact imbued with a dark, inexplicable power. I locked myself in the house for weeks, shutting out the world as I delved deeper into the mystery. I spent long hours scanning old records, interviewing the few elderly neighbors who still remembered something of the house's history, and even visiting the local cemetery to search for clues about my family's past. I learned that several generations ago, a series of tragedies had befallen our lineage, deaths that were ruled as accidents but whispered about in hushed tones as curses. I found an old diary belonging to one of my ancestors that mentioned a picture of doom that had haunted the family for decades. The diary described how the photograph changed with each passing day, each change foreshadowing a calamity or a deep sorrow that would soon befall the family. I read those entries with trembling hands, each word reinforcing the terrible truth that what I was experiencing was not a coincidence, but part of a legacy of suffering. As my obsession grew, the changes in the photograph became more rapid and more disturbing. In one particularly harrowing instance, I awoke at dawn to find that the photograph now depicted a scene of unspeakable horror, a funeral scene in a fog-shrouded cemetery, with the figures in the image weeping inconsolably over a fresh grave. I felt as though the weight of that sorrow was pressing down on me, and I could not shake the sense that my own fate was now inextricably linked to the grim events portrayed before me. I spent the entire day in a daze, unable to concentrate on anything except the foreboding image that had overtaken the photograph. Every minute that passed deepened my dread, as though the photograph were slowly erasing my past and replacing it with a narrative of despair. One night, driven to the brink of despair, I set up a makeshift display in the living room with the photograph as its centerpiece. I arranged a series of candles around it and sat in silence, hoping that by confronting the object head-on, I might glean some insight or at least find a measure of control over my mounting terror. As I sat there in the candlelight, I began to notice a subtle vibration in the air, a soft hum that seemed to emanate from the photograph itself. The flames of the candles flickered in time with this vibration, and for a long moment, I felt as though I were caught in the eye of a storm, suspended between reality and a realm of inexplicable horror. I reached out and touched the frame. The wood was cool and smooth beneath my fingers, yet I could feel a pulsing, almost imperceptible beat beneath the surface, as if the photograph were alive. I pulled back, my hand trembling, and stared at it as if expecting it to speak. In the silence, I swear I could hear a single word, soft, plaintive, and full of sorrow, that echoed in my mind long after it had been uttered. I do not recall what that word was, only that it filled me with a profound sense of loss and inevitability. In that moment, I understood that the photograph was not merely an object, but a vessel, a repository of memories, of curses, of lives lost and tragedies repeated. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to document every detail of what I was experiencing, to write down every change, every emotion, every fragment of horror that the image evoked. And so I wrote, pouring my fear and despair into every line, hoping that if I could capture the truth in words, perhaps I could somehow break the cycle that now bound my fate to this cursed object. I write these words now as part of my final attempt to make sense of it all, even as I feel the relentless pull of destiny drawing me deeper into the mystery. I have no idea what tomorrow will bring, nor do I know if I will ever be free of this nightmare. All I know is that the photograph changes daily, and with each change, it reveals another chapter in a story that I am forced to live, a story of sorrow, of fate, and of a horror that defies all explanation. I leave this account as a warning to anyone who might one day come across a mysterious photograph, an artifact that seems to alter its image with each passing day. Do not be seduced by its beauty or the allure of its history. The truth it contains may be too terrible to bear, and once you look into its shifting face, you may find that your own fate is sealed. I have learned this the hard way, and I fear that I am already too far gone to turn back. As I conclude this entry, I feel a profound emptiness in my soul, a darkness that grows with each tick of the clock and each subtle alteration in the photograph. I know not how much longer I can endure the weight of this curse, but I must persist. I must document. I must record, in the hope that someday someone will understand the true horror of what I have experienced, and perhaps find a way to break the cycle of despair that has haunted my family for generations. I now brace myself for another day, for another change in the photograph that will surely herald new sorrows and unseen tragedies. I sit here in the dim light of my study, the image of that cursed photograph burned into my mind, and I know that I am no longer alone. The photograph changes daily, and with each new image, it takes a little more of me away until I am nothing but a shadow of my former self. This is my truth, my confession, my final testament to the horror that has claimed my life piece by piece. I write not in hopes of salvation, but as a record for those who might someday follow in my footsteps, only to discover that some mysteries are best left unsolved. The photograph that changes daily is not a relic of the past. It is a living nightmare, and it is coming for all of us. I cannot say when the changes began to accelerate or when the weight of this cursed object pressed upon my soul with full, unbearable force. All I know is that every morning the photograph revealed new horrors, and with each new detail the past and future seemed to merge into one endless nightmare. I have spent sleepless nights, desperate days, and agonizing moments in which I felt the very fabric of my existence unraveling before my eyes. The photograph, this relic of sorrow and mystery, has become my constant companion and my relentless tormentor. Now I must record the final chapter of this ordeal, for I fear that if I do not, my story will be lost to the same abyss that has claimed so many before me. I awoke one cold morning with a dread so profound it nearly stole my breath. The air in the house was heavy and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours until I forced myself to rise. The photograph was there on the mantel, its image now more distorted than ever. I could see not only the familiar faces of my ancestors, but also new, sinister figures that did not belong. There was a woman whose eyes burned with a sorrow I could not fathom, a man whose mouth was twisted into a silent scream, and a dark shape looming behind them, a presence that seemed to absorb all light and hope. As I moved closer, my hands trembled and my heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. I reached out, almost against my will, and lifted the frame from the mantel. The photograph felt cold in my hands, as if it had been touched by something not of this world. I placed it on the table in the dim light of the early day and sat down. I opened my journal, its pages filled with years of anxious scribbles and fevered attempts to capture the truth behind the changes. I had recorded each detail meticulously. The shifting expressions, the rearranged positions, even the subtle alterations in the background that hinted at events beyond the scope of mortal understanding. Today, however, was different. Today the image had transformed entirely. The family gathering that once appeared formal and distant had melted into a tableau of despair and ruin. The room depicted in the photograph was no longer the parlor of our ancestral home, but a decrepit chamber shrouded in darkness. The figures wore expressions of terror, and the background revealed a jagged window through which a storm of fire and blood seemed to pour. I could almost hear their screams, as if the sound had been etched into the paper itself. And in the center of the chaos, a solitary figure stared directly at me, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a face contorted by anguish. His gaze seemed to follow my every movement, piercing the veil between then and now, as if he were trying to communicate a message meant solely for me. I could feel a presence in the room, a force that was not content to remain a silent witness to my suffering. The photograph had become a portal through which the past bled into the present, and I realized with mounting horror that I was not simply an observer, but an unwilling participant in a legacy of pain and doom. I remembered the faded letter I had found tucked away in a drawer shortly after my arrival at the house. It had been written by an ancestor whose hand trembled as he confessed his deepest fears, a warning that the photograph would change to reveal the truth of our family's cursed fate. The letter spoke of a series of tragedies, of lives cut short by inexplicable events, and of a dark force that had haunted our bloodline for generations. I had dismissed the letter at first as the ramblings of a troubled man, but now I could no longer ignore its implications. I spent the morning poring over old records in the town archives, searching for any mention of the mysterious photograph and the events it seemed to predict. I uncovered newspaper clippings and dusty monographs that recounted unsolved deaths and inexplicable disasters, stories that bore uncanny similarities to the images I now saw. One account described a fatal fire that had consumed a family home, with survivors speaking of a photograph that had foretold the tragedy. Another told of a shipwreck in which the only surviving member later claimed that a mysterious picture had appeared among the wreckage, depicting a ghostly crew lost to the depths. In each instance, the photograph had become a harbinger of death and sorrow, a warning that was ignored until it was too late. I realized then that my own fate was inextricably linked to this cursed object. With each passing day, as the photograph changed its image, so too did my world shift toward an inevitable end. I began to see the patterns, the slight alterations in the faces, the way the shadows moved within the frame, the recurring presence of that solitary figure whose eyes glowed with a mixture of desperation and malice. The changes were not random but deliberate, as if some ancient force was using the photograph to record and orchestrate our family's tragedies. That evening, as dusk settled and the house was bathed in a pale, uncertain light, I knew that I had to confront the photograph once more. I sat in the living room, the silence around me heavy with unspoken dread, and placed the frame on the table in front of me. I lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, preparing myself for what I feared might be the final revelation. When I opened my eyes again, the image had changed once more. This time, it was as if the photograph had peeled away its veneer of antiquity to reveal a raw, brutal truth. The setting was a ruined mansion, its walls crumbling and overgrown with vines, and the figures in the picture were no longer dignified ancestors, but ragged, tormented souls, their faces contorted with fear and regret. In the center, the solitary figure appeared again, closer now, his eyes locked on mine in a silent plea. I could feel his presence as if he were reaching out to me from the depths of the frame, a spectral hand extended in desperation. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the cool surface of the photograph. In that moment, the candle flickered violently, and I heard a soft, almost inaudible sound, a sigh or a whisper, I could not tell which. The sound filled the room, reverberating in my ears until it became a low hum that seemed to merge with the beating of my heart. I felt a profound sadness well up inside me, a sorrow that was not entirely my own, but shared by those who had suffered before me. I knew then that the photograph was not simply a record of past tragedies, but a living document of our collective grief. It was a repository of the souls lost to time, a silent witness to the pain and despair that had haunted our family for generations. And now it was calling to me, urging me to confront the truth of my heritage, to accept the curse that had been laid upon us. I gathered every scrap of courage I had left and began to speak aloud to the photograph. I asked, trembling, "What do you want from me? Why do you show me these images?" For several long minutes, there was nothing but the sound of my own voice echoing in the empty room. Then, as if stirred by my plea, the candlelight dimmed further and the photograph began to shift before my eyes. The figures moved slowly, their expressions changing from sorrow to anger, from despair to resignation. The solitary figure stepped forward, his features blurring and sharpening in an almost hypnotic rhythm. I could not tear my eyes away, my mind caught in a web of fear and fascination. In that suspended moment, I felt as though I were no longer alone. A presence, dark and ancient, filled the room, pressing in on me from all sides. I could sense its power in the very air, as if it had seeped into the walls and floors of the house, making every surface a conduit for its malevolence. I knew that I was standing at the precipice of something far greater and far more terrible than I had ever imagined. The figure in the photograph seemed to reach out, and I felt a cold, invisible hand brush against my skin. The touch was fleeting, but its impact was profound, sending shivers down my spine and igniting a terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I struggled to maintain control, to hold on to the remnants of my sanity in the face of this inexplicable force. I spent what felt like hours in that state, speaking to the photograph, pleading for it to reveal its secrets. In the dim glow of the candlelight, I began to discern words forming in a shifting image. They were not clear, not as clear as if someone had written them in ink, but they were there, a message that seemed to be meant only for me. I could make out phrases like, "Accept your destiny," and "The curse cannot be undone." The words haunted me, echoing in my mind long after the image had faded to a static scene of familiar, unchanging faces. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the terrible truth. The photograph was not merely a cursed object. It was a living testament to a legacy of suffering, a mirror reflecting the endless cycle of tragedy that had plagued my family for centuries. I had been drawn into this web of horror by a twist of fate, and now there was no escape. The photograph had changed daily, each new image a harbinger of misfortune, a glimpse into the dark destiny that awaited me if I did not break the cycle. In a final, desperate act, I resolved to end this torment once and for all. I gathered the photograph, my journal, and every piece of evidence I had compiled over these agonizing weeks, and I prepared to leave the house that had become both my refuge and my prison. I believed that if I could simply rid myself of this cursed relic, perhaps the curse would be lifted and the endless sorrow would finally cease. I stepped into the cold morning air, the weight of my burden nearly unbearable. The house loomed behind me like a specter, its broken windows and sagging roof a testament to the decay of time and the suffering that had taken root within its walls. I clutched the photograph tightly, feeling its cold presence against my chest, as if it were alive and aware of my every movement. I walked through the overgrown yard and down the cracked stone steps, my mind a tumult of fear, regret, and a desperate hope for redemption. I had no destination in mind, only the burning need to rid myself of the cursed object and escape the relentless horror it had inflicted upon me. I reached the edge of the property and paused, looking back at the house one last time. In the dusty window, I thought I saw a figure, a pale, gaunt face that watched me with hollow eyes, a silent farewell that chilled me to the core. I did not hesitate. I turned and began walking, determined to find a place where I could destroy the photograph and break the curse, even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. Days passed as I wandered from town to town, always on the move, always looking over my shoulder. I visited antique shops, consulted with local historians, and sought out anyone who might have heard of a cursed photograph that changed daily. I learned fragments of the story, a tale of forbidden love, of betrayal, and of a tragic death that had cursed my bloodline. Each revelation only deepened my despair and confirmed the inescapable truth. The photograph was a record of that ancient tragedy, a reminder that the sins of the past were never truly forgotten. The curse was not just on the object, but on me, on all of us who were tied to that dark history. I reached a small, isolated town in the mountains, a place that seemed frozen in time, untouched by modernity and steeped in local legends of spirits and curses. In this town, I met an old woman who was said to have knowledge of the supernatural, a woman who had lived her entire life in the shadow of tragedy. With a voice that trembled like a fragile reed, she told me the final part of the story. She spoke of a forbidden union between a man and a woman from rival families, a love that had ended in a brutal betrayal and a death so sorrowful that the very earth had wept. The photograph, she claimed, was created on the night of that fateful tragedy, imbued with the anguish and despair of all who had suffered. It was cursed by the forces of grief and vengeance, destined to change every day until the cycle of sorrow was finally broken by an act of true absolution, a sacrifice of love and loss that would set the trapped souls free. Her words echoed in my mind as I continued my journey. I knew that I had to find a way to perform that sacrifice, even if I did not fully understand what it entailed. I gathered every scrap of information, every whispered legend and fragmented tale, and slowly, a plan began to form in my tortured mind. I would return to the house that had been my prison, confront the legacy of my ancestors, and perform the ritual that was required to break the curse. It was a desperate gamble, one that might cost me everything, but I saw no other choice. I returned to the house one bleak afternoon, the sky overcast and heavy with rain. The building looked more forlorn than ever, its decaying facade a physical manifestation of the sorrow and darkness that had seeped into its walls. I stepped inside and felt a chill run through me, as if the very air were mourning the tragedies it had witnessed. I moved cautiously through the silent corridors, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I reached the room where the photograph had first been placed and set it carefully on a table in the center of the room. I arranged the candles and prepared the ritual items I had gathered from the old woman and my own research, small tokens of remembrance, relics of the past that had once belonged to those who had suffered. As dusk fell and the room was bathed in the flickering light of candles, I opened my journal and began to read aloud the words I had painstakingly compiled, words that told the story of the tragedy, the curse, and the need for sacrifice. My voice trembled as I recited the ancient verses, the air thick with the weight of unspoken sorrow. The photograph, fixed on the table, began to change once more. The faces in the image shifted rapidly, their expressions contorting between grief and anger, between longing and despair. In a final, heart-wrenching moment, the image settled on a scene of utter devastation, a vision of a burning house, of souls lost in a conflagration of heartbreak and betrayal. A single tear traced down my cheek as I whispered the final lines of the ritual. In that instant, the room seemed to grow darker. The candle flames flickered violently, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. I felt as if the boundaries between past and present were collapsing, as if the ghosts of those who had suffered were now standing before me. The photograph shuddered, and the faces within it blurred into a swirling mass of sorrow and fury. Then, as if a veil were being lifted, I saw it clearly, a pale hand reaching out from the image, a spectral grasp that sought to pull me into the nightmare of the past. I screamed and staggered back, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. The air around me grew cold, and for a moment I felt as if the very ground beneath my feet were shifting. I could see, in the dim candlelight, the faint outline of figures emerging from the shadows, ancient faces twisted in grief, eyes hollow with despair, voices murmuring in a language I could not understand. They moved silently, their presence both terrifying and pitiful. I realized then that the curse was not simply a force of anger and vengeance, but one of eternal sorrow, a relentless cycle of pain that bound the souls of the past to the present. As the ritual reached its climax, the photograph began to glow with a sickly, phosphorescent light. The light pulsed in time with my heartbeat, growing brighter and then dimmer, until it seemed to fill the entire room with an otherworldly radiance. I could feel the spirits pressing in around me, their silent pleas mingling with a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. In that final moment, I understood what had to be done. I knew that I had to offer myself as the sacrifice, to let the curse claim me, so that the souls trapped within the photograph might finally be set free. I sank to my knees before the table, the cold, hard floor a stark reminder of the reality of my predicament. I clutched the photograph in my trembling hands and closed my eyes. I thought of everything I'd lost, the family I never knew, the hope I had once held, the life I had so desperately tried to build. In my heart, I felt a profound sorrow for all the souls bound to this cursed relic. I whispered an apology into the darkness, a plea for forgiveness that trembled on my lips. The candle flames guttered as the final words of the ritual left my mouth. For a moment, there was silence. Then the photograph began to dissolve, its image shattering like glass. The faces and scenes melted away, replaced by an endless, swirling void of darkness and light. I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if my very heart were being wrenched free, and I cried out in agony. The ghosts around me wailed, their voices merging into a single, mournful lament that filled the room with sorrow. I opened my eyes one final time and saw the photograph vanish completely, leaving behind only a blank, unmarked frame resting on the table. The figures that had haunted the image were gone, their tormented souls seemingly released into the ether. I felt a deep, piercing emptiness, as if a part of me had been ripped away, and then everything went silent. I do not know how much time passed after that moment. I lost all sense of time and space as the darkness claimed me, my consciousness drifting away on a tide of pain and release. In the final moments before I succumbed, I felt an odd peace, a calm resignation that came from knowing that the curse had been broken, that the endless cycle of sorrow had finally been halted. I sensed that the voices, the ghosts, the anguish of centuries had been set free, their burden lifted by my sacrifice. When I awoke again, I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the old house, the first rays of dawn filtering through the cracked windows. The room was silent and empty, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by a fragile stillness. I struggled to sit up, my body weak and trembling as if it had been drained of every ounce of strength. I looked around in confusion, half expecting to see the ghosts or the shifting image of the photograph, but there was nothing. The mantel was bare, the frame empty, and the room appeared as if it had never harbored a cursed relic at all. For a long time, I sat there in silence, trying to reconcile the fragments of my shattered reality. I felt different somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted, yet I also sensed an irreversible change within me, a loss of a part of myself that I could not recover. The curse had been broken, but the price had been steep. I knew that I would never be the same again. The memories of that final night, the pain and sorrow, would haunt me forever. In the days that followed, I left the house and wandered the countryside, seeking solitude and healing from the ordeal I had endured. I wrote down my experiences in a final journal, hoping that my words might serve as a warning to others who might one day encounter a cursed object of inexplicable power. I spoke of the photograph that changed daily, of the sorrow that it carried, and of the terrible sacrifice that was required to break its hold. I urged anyone who encountered such an object to be wary, to heed the signs, and above all, to remember that some mysteries are best left unsolved. I now live in a small town far from that accursed house, surrounded by the quiet hum of everyday life. Yet I am never free from the memory of that final revelation. Every night, as I close my eyes, I can still see the blank frame on the mantel, feel the ghostly touch of the photograph that once was, and hear the mournful voices of those whose souls were released. I have learned that some horrors leave their mark not in visible scars, but in the hidden recesses of the heart and mind, a darkness that can never be fully banished. I write these words as a true account of what I experienced, a testament to the terrible power of objects steeped in tragedy and despair. The photograph that changed daily was not merely a relic of the past. It was a living nightmare that consumed everything in its path, demanding a sacrifice that I was forced to make. I have paid that price, and though the curse has been broken, the memory of that night remains with me like a shadow that will never fully fade. I end this account with a simple warning for anyone who might come across a mysterious photograph or any other object that seems to defy the natural order. Do not be seduced by its beauty or its mystery. Some truths are too terrible to confront, and some curses are too potent to be undone without a price. Remember my story, remember my sacrifice, and know that in the end, the past has a way of reaching out and claiming us all. I write these final words with a heavy heart and a soul forever changed. May my account serve as a caution to those who seek to unravel mysteries that lie beyond the veil of ordinary life. I have seen the final revelation, and I have survived, but at a cost that no one should ever have to pay. The photograph that changes daily is gone now, its malevolent power broken, yet its legacy lingers in the quiet corners of my mind, a reminder that some curses are eternal. I am free, or so I hope, but I know that the memory of that cursed object will remain with me for as long as I live. And so, I close this chapter not with a sense of victory, but with a solemn understanding that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.